Hello and welcome to Frontrunner Motorsport. This weekend we have the running of the 68th New Zealand Grand Prix, a very important race in the junior formula calendar. So let's go back through the history books and look at every New Zealand Grand Prix winner ever. All of them from 1950 to 2024. This is going to be a three-part series, all coming out this week, with the final part coming out after the final race of the 2024 Formula Regional Oceania season. That means the 2024 champion is going to be included, which, with no previous winners entering in 2024, means that whoever wins will be the 50th different winner of the New Zealand Grand Prix. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and let's jump into the video. 1950 John McMillan. The first New Zealand Grand Prix winner was John McMillan 74 years ago. Despite the New Zealand Grand Prix starting at the same time as the first ever Formula 1 championship, it was and never has been part of Formula 1. John McMillan won in a Jackson Special in a field made up entirely of New Zealanders, with the exception of Australian Gary Coughlin, who took pole position in an MG and then didn't start the race due to engine issues. This was the only New Zealand Grand Prix to be held at the Oceania military base circuit. You'll notice I'm not talking much about John McMillan, and that's because he's a complete mystery. Apparently known for being a competent engineer and racing driver in the 1950s, the only thing I know for sure is he won the first New Zealand Grand Prix. 1954 Stan Jones. The second New Zealand Grand Prix was a few years after the first and was won by Australian Stan Jones in a Maybach 3800cc special. The German luxury line is not exactly known for their racing pedigree. It's a bit like entering a sailing contest in the Titanic. It just seems wrong on so many levels. Stan Jones won ahead of a slightly more international field with a few Australians and a couple of British drivers. He went on to win the Australian Grand Prix in 1959 and retired from motorsport as the money ran out, passing away at the age of 50 on his birthday. 1955 Prince Birra Banu Dej Banu Barn. Also known as Prince Birra of Siam, an actual prince, the grandson of the king, who was the inspiration for the king in A King and I. That king. Well, Prince Birra was also a very talented race driver. Most of his success was pre-war in his cousin's White Mouse team, but he did take wins in non-championship races later and scored a couple of points finishes in Formula 1. His final racing season was 1955, which he started by winning the New Zealand Grand Prix. His Maserati held off the Ferraris of Peter Whitehead and Tony Gaze. After retiring from motorsport, Prince Birra competed in sailing at the Olympics in 1956 and 1960, and he is instrumental in deciding the Thai racing colours, and he has a circuit named after him in Thailand. 1956, 1959 and 1962, Stirling Moss. One of the legends of the sport, Stirling Moss won just about everything except a Formula 1 title. His first win in the New Zealand Grand Prix saw him beat the Ferraris of Peter Whitehead and Tony Gaze, who must have been sick of the New Zealand podium at this point. Moss won his 3 New Zealand Grand Prix for 3 different teams. His first in a Maserati 250F, his second in 1959 was in a Cooper, ahead of Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren, and his third and final New Zealand win was in a Lotus in 1962. Moss is an incredible driver, and his name on the trophy boosts it in stature immensely. 1957 Reg Parnell. The man who was third on the first ever Formula 1 podium, Reg Parnell won Ferrari's first New Zealand Grand Prix, ahead of Peter Whitehead and Stan Jones. Tony Gaze didn't turn up in 1957, probably sick of the New Zealand Grand Prix. Actually, he had retired at the end of the year previous, but he and Peter Whitehead are the original Team Rockets of the motor racing world. Reg Parnell, on the other hand, did win the New Zealand Grand Prix, and it was his greatest success in motorsport in a collection of non-championship wins. He retired from racing soon after and led Aston Martin to success at Le Mans and set up his own Formula 1 team. 1958, 1960 and 1961, Jack Brabham. The first 3-time winner of the event was another legend of Grand Prix racing, 3-time champion Jack Brabham. This was before he set up his own team though, so he took all 3 of these wins in a Cooper. His first couple of wins were not the strongest fields of all time, but his 1961 win was special, beating Bruce McLaren, Graham Hill, Jim Clark, Denny Hulme and Stirling Moss amongst others. The first 3-time winner beating out Moss by a year. Shame he never won a 4th with his own Brabham team. 1963, John Certies. This would start a 2-year stretch of winning for John Certies, who took his Lola Mark IV to victory ahead of some big names, sharing a podium with Angus Hislop and Jim Palmer. This was the first New Zealand Grand Prix to be held at Pukekohe, which is where a majority of the New Zealand Grand Prix have been held. A year later, he was winning the Formula 1 Championship for Ferrari, as well as finishing on the podium at Le Mans. He would take 6 Grand Prix wins in his 12-year career for Ferrari, Cooper and Honda, and would be the very first Can-Am champion in 1966, as well as running his own team in Formula 1. 1964, Bruce McLaren. Unbelievably, Bruce McLaren was the first Kiwi to win the New Zealand Grand Prix since the very first one 14 years earlier. He took his Cooper to victory ahead of Denny Hulme and Timmy Mayer, a very talented trio of drivers. This was the first time Ken Smith entered, although he failed to qualify. We'll get back to him later. For the first time, this race was part of the Tasman Series, a short series held early in the year across New Zealand and Australia, with a fair few Formula 1 drivers taking part. Bruce McLaren also won the first Tasman in 1964. 2 years later, Bruce McLaren started his own team, just like Bram and Certies, and would take a win for his own team in Formula 1. Sadly, he was killed in a crash in 1970, but his legacy lives on with the McLaren team in Formula 1. 1965 and 1966, Graham Hill. Another Formula 1 legend, champion, and another who started his own team. Did you get a discount on spare parts if you won the New Zealand Grand Prix? Graham Hill was racing a Brabham for the Dave Mackay-owned Scuderia Veloce in 1965 and for BRM in 1966, ahead of teammate Jackie Stewart. This was also the first round of the Tasman Series, which Graham Hill failed to win both times. In 1968, he won his second Formula 1 title and followed that with a win at Le Mans and the Indy 500. He was killed in a plane crash in 1975. 1967, Jackie Stewart. Technically, he ran his own team much later and more through his son, but it almost counts. Sir Jackie Stewart is another who could be considered one of the greatest of all times, like most of the drivers on this list. Stewart took his BRM to victory ahead of 2 more British drivers, Jim Clark and Richard Atwood. Stewart would be the last British driver to win the New Zealand Grand Prix until Lando Norris took the crown 49 years later. Jim Clark dominated Stewart in the Tasman Series, but Clark never won the New Zealand Grand Prix, one of the few things he didn't win at this time. Jackie Stewart would go on to take 3 Formula 1 championships and lead the way for safety in Formula 1, a majorly important player in what Formula 1 would become long after he retired from racing after 1973. 1968 and 1969, Chris Amon. As the 60s came to an end, another New Zealander stepped forward to take back the New Zealand Grand Prix from foreign invasion. The great Chris Amon took 2 wins in a row and the last for Ferrari, beating Pierre's Courage, Jochen Rindt and the future winner Frank Gardner. Amon would win 1 Tasman Series as well in 1969. He is such a legend in New Zealand, he has a circuit named after him that has hosted a fair few runnings of the New Zealand Grand Prix. He never won a Formula 1 race despite coming close numerous times, but he did win at Le Mans and would continue racing in New Zealand up to 1975, still racing in Formula 1 at the time. 1970, Frank Matik. The first time the New Zealand Grand Prix was won by someone who wasn't nor never would be a Formula 1 driver since Stan Jones in 1954. Frank Matik was a very quick Australian who had taken a fastest lap in this race previously, quicker than the likes of Clark, Hill and Brabham. Frank beat Derek Bell and Graham Lawrence in his self-entered McLaren Chevrolet. The grid was a lot weaker than it had been in previous years, with far fewer stars of Formula 1 entering. He also won the Australian Grand Prix and had a lot of success in that part of the world. He retired from motorsport a few years after his win and was a successful businessman in Australia. 1971, Neil Allen. Beat the previous year's winner Frank Matik by just 0.4 of a second. Neil Allen was also racing in a self-entered McLaren Formula 5000 car, maybe not as well known as others on this list, but Neil Allen was a popular driver during a short motor racing career in the late 60s and early 70s, and took a popular win here in the New Zealand Grand Prix. What little information I can find on the man, he seemed to race in just about anything he can get his hands on, and was a major rival for Frank Matik. You rarely see one without the other. 1972, Frank Gardner. The 3-time British touring car champion Frank Gardner did race in Formula 1 in a customer Brabham, but without success. He did take a couple of podiums in non-championship Grand Prix, and he did win the New Zealand Grand Prix in a Works Lola, ahead of Mike Hailwood and David Hobbs. Frank Gardner was a renowned engineer and a talented racer who competed in motorsport until the 90s. He also won the European F5000 Championship, Sandown 500 and was runner-up in the European Formula 2 Championship. 1973 and 1974, John McCormack. The Australian won the New Zealand Grand Prix twice in the Australian-built Elfin Formula 5000 car. Whilst it was a pretty weak field in 1973, it did have some star power in 1974. McCormack beat Teddy Pillay and Peter Geffen, who were both racing Chevrons. The second race was also the only New Zealand Grand Prix held at the Wigram Airfield circuit. McCormack was a three-time Australian Drivers' Champion, but would never be known in Europe. He raced in both single-seaters and sedans, and even raced in the Bathurst 1000 in a Chevrolet Camaro, one of the first to do so. It was a disaster. 1975, Warick Brown. I talked about Warick Brown on this channel years ago. A Formula 1 one-race wonder with Walter Wolf Racing. Warick Brown also won the Tasman Series in 1975, which would be the final one until 2021. Warick Brown won in his Pat Burke Lola Chevrolet, dominating the field a lap clear of everybody else. He would go on to be a successful competitor in the Rothmans International Series, but if you really want more information about the man, then check out this video where I talk about him alone at length. So they were the first 16 winners of the New Zealand Grand Prix. Join us later in the week for part 2 and the next load of winners, as the New Zealand Grand Prix fell from relevancy for many years, mostly because Formula 1 drivers stopped racing in other series. Therefore, it became a much more local competition. But there will be another burst of Formula 1 champions and some great young winners on their way to great things. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss parts 2 and 3. Leave your thoughts down below. Thank you very much for watching and have a good one.